Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we take your source material and really plunge in to pull out the knowledge that matters most.
Yeah, we're your guides through the info you've shared, helping you cut through the noise and zero in on, the essential insights.
And today we've got a stack of documents, all centered around project management. Specifically, we're focusing on two areas that are just absolutely fundamental to how projects actually get delivered.
That's right, communications and procurement.
Exactly. And the sources we're drawing from, they lean into a PMP exam content outline perspective.
Which gives us a fantastic, really structured way to look at these topics. We'll be exploring Task 07, Managing Communications, and Task 09, Planning and Managing Procurement, both critical pieces of the process domain.
And, the material points out this process domain makes up a full half of the test items on that exam.
Wow.
So yeah, we're talking about the core mechanics of getting things done in a project context.
Exactly. These aren't just concepts for some tests. They're really the nuts and bolts of real-world project success.
Which makes this super relevant for you, whether you're formally managing projects, maybe organizing a complex event, or even just trying to coordinate something tricky in your personal life.
Absolutely. Understanding how to effectively communicate and how to acquire what you need, but that's universally key to getting results.
So let's dive into this material.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's start by unpacking Task 07, Managing Communications. Right away, the material hits you with a statistic that kind of stops you in your tracks.
It does. It states that project managers spend approximately 90% of their time communicating.
90%.
90%. That number alone just screams how central communication is to the role. It's not just, a side task.
It is the job.
It is a job in so many ways.
Wow, that's a lot of talking, emailing, and meeting.
It really highlights why doing it effectively is so crucial. And the material helps us think about all these interactions by breaking them down into different classifications.
Right, like the difference between talking to your core team that's internal versus dealing with clients or vendors, which is external.
Exactly. And the formality matters too. You've got formal communication through reports or scheduled meetings versus those quick, informal chats that just happen spontaneously.
And there's official communication, like a project newsletter, versus maybe those unofficial, off-the-record sidebar conversations.
Right. And then the medium itself, verbal versus nonverbal. And nonverbal includes things like your tone of voice or body language, which the material points out can significantly change the meaning, like, conveying sarcasm.
Definitely. Then there's written versus oral, obviously. And vertical, communicating up or down the hierarchy, contrasted with horizontal, talking across to your peers.
Just seeing all these categories laid out shows you the sheer complexity a PM navigates daily. But beyond how you communicate, the material really stresses the importance of listening.
Yes. Effective and active listening. It's not just about hearing words, right?
Yeah.
It's about making sure you actually understand.
Precisely. Active listening involves techniques like, nodding, restating what you think you heard, or paraphrasing it back.
To confirm.
Exactly. The goal is explicit confirmation. Did I get that right? It's just a fundamental tool for preventing misunderstandings that can completely derail a project.
And to figure out who needs what information and how often, the material describes something called communication requirements analysis.
Right. This is the process of systematically figuring out the information needs of all your stakeholders.
So how do you actually do that? Like, how do you dig into what people really need from you?
Well, the material suggests using techniques like interviews, maybe workshops, or even just looking back at lessons learned from previous projects. It's about asking those key questions.
Right.
Like, how often do you need updates? What format works best for you? Email, a dashboard, a meeting, and what level of detail is necessary? Too much is noise, too little is useless.
Asking those up front sounds like it would save a ton of headaches later on.
Oh, absolutely. And based on those needs, then you select your tools.
Right.
The material lists common communication types: face-to-face, video or voice conferencing, email, IM, social media, pretty much everything we use today.
Cover the bases.
It does. And the material reminds us of the basic communication model. You have a sender who encodes a message, transmits it via some medium.
Like email or a phone call?
Right. Then a receiver decodes it, acknowledges they got it, and maybe sends feedback.
And, of course, anything can go wrong in the middle. That's the noise. Yeah.
Exactly. Noise can interfere. It could be a bad connection, sure, but also more subtle things like cultural differences or personal biases affecting how someone interprets the message.
Understanding that model helps you anticipate where things might break down.
It does. And then you choose your communication methods, the actual strategies for exchanging information.
Okay, like interactive methods. That's where information flows back and forth in real time, like in meetings or phone calls.
Yeah, the material notes this is really efficient for building common understanding quickly. Everyone's engaged at the same time.
Or you have push communication. That's where you send information out to specific people, like a formal status report via email.
Right. The key thing there is you've sent it, but you don't necessarily get immediate confirmation they've read it or understood it. It's one way, initially at least.
And then pull communication, where you make information available for people to access whenever they need it, like posting documents on a project website or an internal portal.
That's great for large audiences where the need for the info varies. People pull it when they need it.
Now, the sheer number of people involved dramatically impacts complexity, which brings us to communication channels.
Oh, the formula, yes. The material illustrates how the number of potential connections between people just explodes as the team grows.
Use the formula NN12, where N is the number of people. So for a small team of 5, that's 10 potential communication paths.
But for just 10 people, it jumps to 45. It visually hammers home why you can't just wing communication as the team gets bigger. This complexity is precisely why you need a plan.
The communications management plan.
Exactly.
This plan, as the material outlines it, is basically your roadmap for how you're going to handle all this communication.
Right.
So what are the critical pieces that need to go into it?
It's pretty comprehensive. It details stakeholder needs, the specifics of the information itself, like language, format, level of detail, the purpose of why you're sending it, the frequency and timing.
Who sends it?
Right. Who's responsible for sending it, who manages confidential info, who the recipients are, the methods and technology you'll use, the budget and time allocated for communication activities.
And crucially,
An escalation process for urgent issues, how the plan itself will be updated, maybe a glossary of terms, any constraints like regulations. It's thorough.
that escalation process seems like one of those make or break details. You absolutely need that planned out before things hit the fan.
Oh, absolutely. It tells people exactly what to do when the standard channels aren't working or when a problem is getting serious. The material also simplifies planning with the 5 W's and 1 H approach.
Who, what, when, where, why, and how.
Yep. Answering those questions up front pretty much ensures you've covered your bases for effective communication.
It feels like these guidelines, gather contact info, identify needs, select tech, include all the plan elements, integrate it, distribute it. They sound straightforward, but I bet they get missed a lot in practice.
They really form the backbone of a proactive communication strategy, and the material even touches briefly on communication in agile environments.
Right. It references an image of an information radiator board.
Which is a great example of a highly visual, pull-based method. The whole team can see status at a glance. It's about adapting the core principles.
Okay, let's look at a couple of practice questions from the material that really highlight these points in action. There's one about a developer on a distributed team who's delayed because they don't really understand the requirements coming from the off-site team. The question asks what the PM should do.
And the solution points to facilitating communication to clarify those requirements.
Right.
This just underscores the PM's active role. You don't just sit back. The delay isn't just a technical issue. The root cause is a communication breakdown. The PM needs to step in and fix that.
Yeah, fix the source of the problem, not just the symptom. There's another scenario involving a key stakeholder who really dislikes using virtual collaboration tools.
The classic challenge.
Yeah, they prefer email, phone calls, face-to-face meetings. What's the best approach there?
Well, the recommended action is to align and agree on the communication approach with that stakeholder.
Okay, so work with them.
Exactly. This is a key takeaway. Communication isn't one size fits all. You often have to tailor your methods to the specific needs and, frankly, preferences of your key stakeholders. Forcing them into a tool they won't use is just, well, it's planning for failure.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so that covers how we manage information flow within the project and with stakeholders.
But what about getting the stuff or services we need from outside the project team?
Right. That brings us to task 09, plan and manage procurement.
Procurement. It's all about acquiring those external resources. Could be goods, services, maybe specific results that you need to meet your project objectives but can't provide yourself.
It's essentially the process of buying or outsourcing things.
Pretty much. The material outlines the core steps. First, you identify potential suppliers, research the market, see who's out there.
Then you obtain bids or proposals by sending out requests, RFPs or RFQs, and evaluating what comes back.
And finally, you award contracts, selecting the best supplier based on various criteria: cost, quality, timeline, risk.
And the key consideration here is that all this external buying needs to fit seamlessly into the project's overall time, cost, and quality goals. It needs to align.
Absolutely. And a fundamental decision often made early on is the make or buy analysis.
Ah, the classic question, do we build it ourselves or buy it from someone else?
Exactly that. The material compares the costs. If you're making it yourself, you consider production costs, labor, monitoring, maybe even storage or potential waste.
Okay.
If you're buying, you look at the purchase price, shipping, taxes, maybe holding costs if it's physical goods, ordering costs. This analysis helps you figure out the most economical, maybe the most strategic approach.
Gotcha. So once you decide to buy, you need a strategy for doing it effectively. And that's where the procurement management plan comes in.
Right. This plan basically lays out how the project team will go about acquiring those external goods or services.
What kind of details does this plan cover? What's in it?
The material lists things like the types of contracts you might use. We'll get into those, the specific process for soliciting and evaluating bids, maybe using standardized documents to keep things consistent, and how you'll manage multiple suppliers if you have them. It just ensures a structured, compliant process.
And to get good bids, you need to clearly define exactly what you're buying. That's the job of the Procurement Statement of Work, or SOW, right?
Correct. This SOW is derived from the project's overall scope baseline, but it only focuses on the part being procured externally. It gives a really detailed description of the item or service.
The specs, quantity.
Exactly. Specifications, quantity needed, quality standards, any performance reporting you expect from the seller. This gets distributed to potential sellers.
Sending a clear SOW seems absolutely crucial. It ensures everyone is bidding on the exact same thing and understands what's expected. No ambiguity.
Precisely. Now, to choose the right seller from those bids, the material provides a list of source selection criteria.
Okay, like what?
Things like the vendor's capability and capacity to actually do the work, their cost, or maybe the life cycle cost, how well they can meet your delivery deadlines, their technical expertise and approach. Yeah, relevant past experience, the qualifications of their key staff, their financial stability that's important, maybe their management experience, warranty, past performance, references. The list goes on.
Applying these criteria helps you move beyond just looking at the lowest price.
Right.
To find a supplier who can actually deliver successful.
Definitely. But before you can evaluate bids, you need a list of potential suppliers to send the SOW to.
Right. So how do you create that list of qualified vendors?
Well, the material suggests using historical data from past projects, doing market research, maybe some online searches, and performing vendor assessments.
Assessments like?
Could be interviews, visiting their site, maybe getting samples, checking references and certifications, verifying their financial health and performance. It's really about doing your homework on potential partners.
That process sounds like essential risk reduction. Okay, so once you have your potential vendors identified and vetted, you move to the conducting procurements phase.
This is where you actually get the seller responses. The bids or proposals come back. You evaluate them against your criteria, select the best one, and award the contract.
And the outcome is that formal agreement.
Yep, a legally binding agreement that spells out the commitments of both the buyer and the seller.
Now, before bids are even finalized, the material mentions something called bidder conferences. What are those?
Yeah, these are meetings held after you've issued the request for proposals, but before sellers submit their actual bids.
Okay, why?
The buyer uses them to explain the requirements and contract terms clearly, and crucially, vendors get to ask questions to clarify any doubts they have. It ensures all potential bidders have the same understanding, which makes the competition fair.
That makes sense. Levels the playing field. So after bids come in, there's proposal evaluation and selecting the seller. You're checking if the proposals meet your requirements and criteria.
Right. You're looking for proposals that fall within a competitive range and really demonstrate the technical, financial, and operational ability to meet your needs. Once you've narrowed it down, perhaps to a short list, you often enter negotiation.
This is where the buyer and the chosen seller hash out the final details to reach an agreement before anything gets signed.
Exactly. The material notes that typically a procurement team member, someone with signing authority, leads this negotiation. But they're supported by the project manager and maybe team members who understand the technical or performance requirements deeply.
And all of this hard work culminates in the agreement or the contract itself?
This is the big one. The legally binding document. It obligates the seller to provide the specified work or goods and the buyer to compensate them for it.
What needs to be in that contract?
Well, the material lists crucial components. The detailed procurement SOW schedule milestones, how performance will be reported, pricing and payment terms, general terms and conditions, maybe incentives, insurance, or performance bonds, rules for subcontractor approval, how changes will be handled,
Change control, yeah.
inspection and acceptance criteria, termination clauses, and methods for resolving disputes if they come up.
That sounds like a document you definitely need legal input on. Very detailed.
Absolutely. It defines the entire relationship and sets expectations. Now, the material then dives into different contract types, which is really where the risk allocation comes into sharp focus.
Okay, first up, fixed price, FP contracts.
Right. With fixed price, the total price for the work is set up front and generally doesn't change. The key thing here is the seller bears most of the risk for cost overruns.
If their costs are higher than expected, that's their problem.
Pretty much they eat it, so the buyer has lower risk, especially if the scope of work is very clearly defined. This type works best when you know exactly what you need.
Yeah, there are subtypes.
Yeah, the material mentions firm fixed price, FFP, which is the most common. Then there's FPIF, fixed price incentive fee, where there are incentives for meeting performance targets, and FPIPA, fixed price with economic price adjustment, which allows for adjustments due to things like inflation.
Okay, so FP is good when the scope is rock solid. What if things are less clear, maybe more experimental or R&D?
That's where cost reimbursable contracts often come in. Here, the seller is reimbursed for their actual legitimate costs, plus they get a fee, which is their profit.
So the buyer pays whatever it costs.
Essentially, yes, which means the buyer bears most of the risk because the final cost is uncertain at the start. But this type offers flexibility when the scope isn't fully defined, maybe for research or exploratory work where you don't know exactly what you'll find.
And there are subtypes here too.
Yep. Cost plus fixed fee, CPFF, where the fee is a set amount. Cost plus incentive fee, CPIF, where the fee is tied to meeting specific performance targets, similar to FPIF but on the cost reimbursable side. And cost plus award fee, CPIF, where the fee is based on more subjective criteria like how satisfied the client is.
Interesting. And then there's the third main type, time and material, T&M.
Right, T&M is kind of a hybrid between the other two. The buyer pays for the hours worked by the seller's staff at an agreed rate and the cost of materials used.
So the risk is?
The risk is more shared. It's often used for things like consultancy work, getting expert services, or staff augmentation where you're primarily buying labor hours rather than a fixed, tangible outcome. Often these contracts include a not-to-exceed clause or a time limit to give the buyer some cost control.
The material has a great little chart showing how buyer versus seller risk changes across these types, doesn't it?
It does. It clearly shows fixed price is low buyer risk, high seller risk. Cost reimbursable is the opposite, high buyer risk, low seller risk. And T&M sits somewhere in the middle.
That chart's a really effective way to visualize the core difference. So choosing the right contract type is a big strategic decision.
Absolutely. It depends heavily on how well-defined your scope is and your organization's tolerance for risk. And the material makes a point to say that unclear requirements, regardless of the contract type you pick, are a major risk that impacts both cost and schedule.
Makes sense. Okay, so once the contract is signed, the work starts, but it's not over for the project manager. You have to control procurements.
Exactly. This is the ongoing process of actively managing the contract and the relationship with the seller throughout the project lifecycle. It involves monitoring their performance, making any necessary changes correctly, and eventually closing out the contract. The material notes this process happens continuously, not just at the end.
So what does the project manager actually do during this phase? What are their responsibilities?
Well, the material lists key things like approving the seller's work as it progresses, monitoring their cost and schedule performance against the plan, ensuring their work meets the required quality standards defined in the contract.
Handling changes.
Yes, managing any changes to the contract scope or terms through the formal change control system, and also identifying and mitigating risks associated with the seller or the contract itself.
The material also mentions inspection and audit in this context.
Right. Inspection is generally looking closely at the seller's deliverables or their work process to make sure it meets the specified requirements. An audit is often broader, maybe reviewing the entire procurement process itself to ensure it complied with organizational policies and procedures.
And if changes are needed to the contract during execution, say the scope needs tweaking.
You absolutely have to use a contract change control system. This is the formal process for requesting, evaluating, approving, or rejecting and documenting any modifications to that signed contract. It's crucial to prevent uncontrolled scope creep or unauthorized work.
Keeps everyone honest and on the same page. What if disputes arise despite having a good contract and trying to manage it well?
It happens. The material outlines a typical escalation path. You'd start with trying negotiated settlements, just trying to work it out directly between the buyer and seller.
Okay, if that fails.
If direct negotiation doesn't resolve it, you might move to alternative dispute resolution or ADR.
Like mediation or arbitration.
Exactly those. Mediation uses a neutral third party to help the parties reach their own voluntary agreement. The mediator facilitates, but doesn't decide. Arbitration, on the other hand, uses a neutral arbitrator or a panel who hears both sides and then makes decision that is usually binding.
And litigation is the last resort.
Yeah, the flowchart in the material shows that escalation from negotiation, maybe to mediation, then perhaps arbitration, and potentially ending up in court litigation if absolutely necessary. But that's usually the least preferred option.
Hopefully you resolve it much earlier.
Yeah.
Okay, the final step in the procurement lifecycle is closing procurements.
Right. This is the formal process of completing each contract once all the work is done and accepted. It involves verifying that all deliverables meet the requirements, settling the final payments, resolving any outstanding issues, and importantly, archiving all the contract documentation.
For future reference and lessons learned.
Exactly. Lessons learned are key. The material wraps up the procurement section with some solid best practices for managing contracts and suppliers effectively.
Like what? Give us a few highlights.
Things like keeping your contract records meticulously organized, rigorously using that change control system we talked about, always assessing the risks of any proposed changes, keeping contracts documented and updated, defining clear performance reporting requirements from the seller, setting clear milestones, monitoring any work being done off-site, and processing payments efficiently and on time.
Those practices sound like they turn the theoretical process into, well, smooth execution and help avoid common pitfalls like disputes or delays.
They absolutely do. They're about proactive management.
Okay, let's look at a couple of final questions that kind of link procurement back to other project management areas, like communication. There's one scenario about a project being terminated early.
Okay, termination.
And the finance manager needs specific information about the financial impact, the costs incurred, things like that. What's the first thing the PM should do according to the material?
And the answer given is check the communication management plan.
Ah, see? It loops back.
Exactly. It shows how interconnected these processes are. Even in a difficult situation like project termination, you rely on your predefined plan for how and what to communicate to key stakeholders, including finance, about critical events and their impact.
Right. You don't just make it up on the spot in a crisis. You should have a process outlined in your plan. Okay, one more. This one describes a situation where changes were implemented on the project,
Okay.
but maybe without following the proper process. And now these changes are causing delays because they're inconsistent with the original plan or requirements. What should the PM do?
The correct action identified is to submit a change request to the Change Control Board, CCB.
Formalize it, even after the fact.
Yes. This question really highlights the absolute necessity of formal change control, especially when dealing with scope-impacting changes that will affect cost, schedule, maybe quality or risk. You have to manage changes through the defined system, which typically involves getting evaluation, buy-in, and formal authorization, often from stakeholders represented on that CCB.
That's a critical lesson. Changes need a process, always. Okay, so we've really dug into managing communications and planning and managing procurement today, drawing heavily from the core principles laid out in this source material.
Yeah, we've seen that communication isn't just talking, it's this complex system that needs really careful planning, understanding all the different types and methods, and that crucial element of active listening. And remembering that statistic,
The 90%.
the 90% of a PM's time, it's huge.
And we've explored procurement from that initial make or buy decision through selecting the right partner, navigating the different contract types with their unique risk profiles,
Big differences there.
and then actively managing that relationship and the contract all the way to closure.
And these areas, as the material emphasizes through its PMP focus, they really are foundational to the process of project management. They are where the rubber meets the road in getting things done with and through people, and also using external resources effectively.
So think about your own endeavors, whether they're big formal projects or smaller tasks. Could a more deliberate approach to how you communicate with everyone involved smooth things out?
Or perhaps, could a clearer process for deciding whether to buy something versus doing it yourself and then managing that external relationship make a difference? Mastering these two areas truly equips you to handle a lot of the complexity and risk inherent in pretty much any project.
And here's a final thought for you to consider as you wrap up this deep dive with us. Given how tightly communications, stakeholders, and procurement are interwoven, when you communicate with stakeholders about procurement constantly, which of these areas, communications or procurement, do you think poses the bigger hidden risk to a project's success? The one that project managers perhaps most often underestimate.
That's a good one. Communications or procurement, the bigger hidden risk, and how might thinking about that specific connection, that interplay, help you in your next project or endeavor? Something to reflect on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.